It's the winter of 1778, and despite the intervention of the French, the American Revolution appears to be on its final legs. Just a few months ago, Washington and his army engaged in three of the largest battles of the Revolution. Despite the Americans' unexpectedly strong performance, they were defeated each time. General Clinton has taken command of British forces. He is confident that he will be able to end the war by launching a prolonged scorched earth campaign against the underdefended South. He knows he must end the war before France is able to fully commit to the American cause. Clinton's strategy was to attack the South by taking his army and splitting it into two. One branch would attack Savannah, Georgia. Another branch would attack Charleston, South Carolina. These two cities would become the hubs for future operations in the South, once captured. After that, the armies would combine into one force and begin marching north, quelling the colonies as they moved. As they neared New York, the remainder of the army that was still held in the city would head out and begin to march south. These two armies would crush any American resistance that came in between them, and they would eventually capture the entire South, pacifying the region. This would leave the North, the hotbed for the Revolution, completely isolated. The British believed that the South was a hotbed for loyalists, and that they were simply waiting for the British to come to their aid so that they could rise up and fight against the Americans. This would prove to be true, as loyalists from throughout the southern colonies would flock to swell the British ranks. Meanwhile, along the western Appalachians, there were many who were loyal to the Americans. In order to deal with this, the British allied with the natives. They paid the natives to launch successive raids against the towns and people living on the western frontier. They hoped that this would prevent them from moving in and joining the main battle for the Carolinas. Over the past years, the Americans have suffered devastating defeats, and now the army is on the brink of collapse. In September, the Americans under Washington had been defeated in the Battle of Brandywine. This defeat allowed the British to seize the American capital, and while it was not tactically important, since the small American government was simply able to pack its bags and flee the city, the knowledge that the capital had been lost, the army defeated, and Congress forced to retreat was surely crushing to American morale. Only 1 month later, Washington marched his army to attack Philadephia and expel the British troops. His men's performance at Brandywine convinced him that victory could be achieved. However, despite another strong attempt, the army was defeated at the Battle of Germantown once more. In June, the largest battle to ever be fought in the North was underway. Washington marched to attack the British in New Jersey, hoping to take advantage as the British army withdrew from Philadelphia to consolidate their power in New York. The Americans had the British on the verge of defeat, but American commander Charles Lee disobeyed orders and bizarrely began to lead reinforcements away from the battle. Viewers of this channel may remember Lee as Washington's rival for command of the American army. Last year, he had refused to bring men to aid Washington for months during the Battle of Trenton. When he finally relented, he was captured by the British when he took a break from his slow march towards Washington to meet with a prostitute miles away from his camp's protection. It's speculated whether the general was acting treasonous to boost his own rank, was serving the British, or was merely incompetent. Sadly, we will never know. But ultimately, his actions caused the Americans to suffer another massive defeat at British hands, the third of which in a very small span of time. If not for the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, it is likely the war would have ended here. But the shocking defeat of the entire British Army Corps at the hands of the Americans finally convinced the French to join their cause. It's very likely that they were regretting that decision after witnessing the events at Germantown and Monmouth. While France had technically joined the war, their support was mostly nominal at this point. Their ships would constantly depart from battle, rather than risk losing any men, and they offered little in the way of infantry support. Washington repeatedly requested that the French send their navy to aid him in an attack upon British-held New York City, but the French adamantly refused. This left Washington isolated, with an army tattered by 3 defeats, unable to launch any offensive attacks, and forced to simply wait for the British to come and land a killing blow. Meanwhile, coming after a string of morale-breaking defeats, the Americans under Washington were enduring one of the hardest winters in American history. Over 24 snowstorms had hammered the American camp. The snowdrifts were over 6 feet tall, and men were both freezing and starving to death. Desertion peaked during this time, and Washington was forced to order several of his soldiers executed so that he could preserve order. When the news of his situation reached Clinton, he began offering payments and pardons to any Americans who would defect to the British cause. He came to believe that the American army was on the brink of utter collapse, and he very well might have been right. In 1778, Clinton would make his move and begin the invasion of the South. This is Grim Battaglia, and you're watching my series on battles of the American Revolution, the Southern Conquest, the sieges of Savannah and Charleston. It's early December 1778, and the British have opened their campaign by sending 4 battleships and 3,500 men to Georgia, where they're able to easily capture the capital city of Savannah in a battle against an ineffectual militia defense. This was to be the British base of operations, and the commander immediately set about having his men construct a complex line of defenses around the city. The line of defenses included several large redoubts, which are further protected by a line of trenches around the walls. The Americans who had been pushed out of Savannah were not yet defeated. They regrouped, and by June, a force of nearly 6,000 men, led by General Lincoln, had regrouped and was surrounding the city, locking the outnumbered British within its walls. Lincoln recognized the impressive British defenses and knew that even with his impressive numbers, he would be unable to take the city. He sent word to America's new ally, France, desperately requesting aid and reinforcements. The French received the message, but they delayed, taking time to capture the island of Grenada in the Caribbean. The French did not just join this war to help out the Americans, they did it at their own ambition, for territorial gain and of crippling Britain. After the capture of the island, the fleet headed towards Georgia. The commander risked hurricane season and was able to arrive earlier than expected. In September, an emissary arrived and informed Lincoln that 4,000 French reinforcements and 26 battleships of the line were coming to reinforce the city. In accordance with an Allied plan, Lincoln and 2,000 of the defenders left the battle to go and hold Charleston, which both the French and the Americans agreed would likely be the British's next target. French D'Estaing and his men landed south of Savannah, and by September 12th, their men had joined the siege, which was now placed under his overall command. Confident of victory, D'Estaing offered the British a 12-hour truce to negotiate their surrender. Knowing that reinforcements were near, the British managed to extend this for a full 24 hours. While the truce held, fresh reinforcements from the north arrived to reinforce the British. A miscommunication between Lincoln and D'Estaing about which force was meant to defend the path to the city had allowed the British to slip by unharmed. At this point, the British strength had grown to around 6,500 men in Savannah. They unloaded their guns from their ships and used them to bolster the outer defenses of the city. On September 19th, the French sailed their fleet up the Saratoga River to engage the French. The narrow river prevented them from sailing up the entire force of their fleet and simply overwhelming the British. They had the British outnumbered still, but with the help of cannons from the city's fortification, the British were able to repel the attack. 2 of the British ships were badly damaged during the engagement. Rather than trying to save them, the British commander wisely decided to scuttle them. He scuttled the ships at a narrow location in the river so that the French would be blocked from sailing their fleet towards Savannah. This tactic was effective, and the massive French fleet was now unable to assist in the coming siege and the coming battle. The idea was proposed that the city be attacked directly, but this was rejected by D'Estaing. He decided that it would be safer to remove the cannons from his ships and place them behind his battle lines so that he could begin bombarding the city and try to break the strong British defenses. This bombardment lasted for several days, but ultimately it would be ineffective. The bombardment destroyed many more American homes than it did British defenses, much to the dismay of the American militia, many of whom lived in the city and watched as their home burned. On October 9th, against the advice of his officers, D'Estaing planned to launch an all-out attack on the city. He consolidated his forces near a redoubt on the British right. He had learned from his intel that the right was guarded by American militiamen who were loyal to the king. These militia were untested in battle and untrained, and supposedly would be easy to break. However, his intel was wrong, and he was in fact about to attack one of the most skilled and battle-hardened British regiments inside the city. The plan would rely heavily on secrecy. The Franco-Americans set out from their camps in the cover of darkness at 4 a.m., hoping to attack before sunrise. However, a thick fog from the river rolled in and caused much confusion. The troops became disoriented in a swamp, and it took until daylight for the attack to actually commence. When the Franco-Americans hit the British defenses, a fierce battle began. The troops held their ground for some time, but the combined firepower of the British artillery and skilled infantry was too much for the Franco-Americans. Attempts to charge the trenches guarding their redoubts were easily repulsed by the British, with the artillery fire supporting them. Meanwhile, a series of attacks were being launched along the rest of the British defenses. These attacks were meant to be fake, simply to draw the British away from the main battle line. But surprisingly, the Franco-Americans were able to easily overwhelm their positions and take their redoubts. This highlighted just how much of a mistake the French commander had made in relying on his faulty intel. Despite the American success at these redoubts, they were unable to hold their victory, with the main battle lines set so far away from them. Back at the main battle, a second wave of attack commenced against the British right. The troops moved forward with all haste and vigor. They were able to pierce the British trenches and began pushing the troops back. During this time, D'Estaing would be injured and shot twice. However, their success in capturing these trenches was not to last. The Franco-Americans soon became overwhelmed by the intense British fire and were forced to retreat. A French officer would remember the day, stating that the moment of retreat from the trenches when the cries of our dying comrades pierced my heart was the bitterest of my life. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the entire war. The Franco-Americans had taken nearly 1,000 casualties during their assault on the city. Meanwhile, British casualties were just nearing 150. With their victory, the British now had a firm base of operations to conduct their campaign in the south. When the news reached London, victory cannons were fired and bells tolled throughout the city. They believed that victory was now only months away. In April, the British had turned their attention towards the American city of Charleston. The loss of Charleston would be catastrophic, the largest American defeat thus far in the war. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 3-1, and George Washington had been able to send only a few thousand troops to aid the Southern Army under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln. By April, the American forces were almost completely surrounded in the city by a naval and military blockade. However, the lone glimmer of American hope was that it's not completely surrounded. American wagons used a single narrow dirt road to ferry food, ammunition, weapons, and outside communications into the embattled port. The precious artery meandered from Charleston out into the South Carolina backcountry, crossing the broad and languid Cooper River via scuttled barges at the Bigham Bridge. Should this road remain open, the Americans can hold out, or at the very least, flee the city should it fall. However, if the British gain control of the road, the American troops inside Charleston will be trapped. On April 13th, General Clinton receives word from an American slave spying that large amounts of supplies are heading down the supply lane to reinforce Charleston. They have weapons, food, and clothing. Clinton decides that he must act. He puts Charleston in charge of 30 cavalry units and orders him to go defeat the Americans defending the Brigham Bridge. At 3 a.m. the next day, Charleston heads out. When he meets an American group of advanced soldiers defending the road, the Americans call out a guard word. Charleston immediately charges through the night and outs the Americans from their position. They continue to pursue them all the way to the Brigham Bridge. When the Americans are defending it, are caught completely off guard. Shocked and disoriented, they begin to flee, heading into the swampy wilderness of South Carolina. Among those fleeing is none other than the brother of George Washington. Inside the Brigham Bridge meeting house, there are several American officers who are unaware of the commotion going on outside. When the British enter, they beg to surrender. However, the British will accept none of that. They viciously stab and cut the Americans to death. One of the loyalists serving with the British Army will report that the Americans were mangled in the most shocking and brutal of manner. After that, the cavalry is sent to pursue the fleeing Americans through the countryside. Over the next 4 weeks, Charleston pursued the British scorched earth campaign by raping and pillaging throughout South Carolina. He showed indifference towards whether the locals were loyal to the crown or to the patriot cause. This would have lasting consequences, as the once loyal southern colonies soon began to resent the British and rise up in rebellion. One notable American who fell victim to this campaign was a young Andrew Jackson. Only 11 at the time, he would remember this for the rest of his life and have his revenge in the War of 1812 during the Battle of New Orleans. General Washington had ordered Lincoln to retreat once the city became indefensible. Lincoln instead took pity on the city's civilian population, whose leadership had pleaded that the Continental troops remain there to protect them. While admirable, this had proved to be a mistake. Now, more than 5,000 American soldiers and sailors were surrounded by a British Army and Navy numbering over 13,000 men. With Charleston's victories, the British were able to completely surround Charleston and completely lock the city off from outside aid. Meanwhile, within the city, Lincoln's mercifulness and pity on the citizens of Charleston would come to bite him in the back. Local loyalists within the city burned the ships that the Americans had hoped to use to escape. With this, Lincoln had no choice. He was forced to surrender the city to the British. Lincoln surrenders over 5,000 men, 400 pieces of artillery, and scores of extremely valuable American supplies to the British. Thousands of captured Americans will spend the next years in Charleston Harbor aboard prison ships where they'll endure brutal conditions. Many will die on those very same ships. Among the notable captured at the surrender were 30 signers of the Declaration of Independence: Thomas Hayward, Edward Rutledge, and Arthur Middleton. The British, fearing that they would somehow contact the outside world, shipped them away to prisons throughout Florida and the Caribbean. The British war in the South was off to a great start. In Savannah, they'd won the largest battle of the war. In Charleston, they'd caused the largest surrender of the war. And now they had their two key bases of operation and were preparing to march north. Soon, they'd engage the Americans at the Battle of Camden, where they'd win a crucial victory. However, the victory wasn't absolute, as one man, known as the South Carolina Swamp Fox, would resort to guerrilla warfare that he learned from battling the Cherokee and use it to hinder and cripple the British war efforts. Join us next week as we look at the Battle of Camden and examine the techniques of the South Carolina Swamp Fox. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. And as always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and please never stop learning.